Welcome to part 1 of our video series on Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Dahmer's life and crimes have fascinated and horrified people for decades, as he committed some of the most gruesome acts imaginable. Dahmer's killing spree spanned over a decade, during which he murdered and dismembered at least 17 young men and boys. In this first installment, we will delve into the early life of Jeffrey Dahmer and the events that led to his descent into darkness. From his troubled childhood to his disturbing fantasies and obsessions, we will explore the factors that may have contributed to the making of a serial killer. So, sit back and brace yourself for the chilling tale of Jeffrey Dahmer. The early years. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1960. His parents were Joyce and Lionel Dahmer, with German and Welsh and Norwegian and Irish ancestry, respectively. Some sources suggest that Dahmer was deprived of attention as a child, while others suggest he was doted upon but with a tense and argumentative mother. Dahmer's father was often absent due to university studies, and his mother had depression and demanded constant attention. Dahmer was an energetic and happy child, but became subdued after a hernia surgery and was regarded as quiet and timid in school due to his father's absence and mother's illnesses. Jeffrey Dahmer showed interest in dead animals from an early age. This fascination may have started when he was 4 years old and saw his father removing animal bones from under their family home. He was excited by the sound the bones made and became obsessed with collecting animal bones, which he referred to as fiddlesticks. He often searched for bones around the house and examined live animals to find their bones. Despite these red flags, Dahmer's parents did not seek professional help for their son. As he grew older, his behavior became more erratic and he began to struggle with alcohol abuse. These factors, combined with a lack of close relationships and a general feeling of disconnection from the world around him, set the stage for the horrific crimes he would later commit. It's important to note that the events of Dahmer's childhood and early life do not excuse his actions, but they do provide some context and insight into the development of his disturbed mind. As we delve deeper into the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, we'll see how these early experiences shaped the man he became and the crimes he committed. In 1966, the Dahmer family moved to Doylestown, Ohio. Dahmer was allowed to choose the name for his new baby brother, David. The same year, Lionel earned his degree and began working as an analytical chemist in Akron, Ohio. In 1968, the Dahmer family moved to Bath Township in Ohio. This was their third move in 2 years and the sixth move since their marriage. The home was situated on 1.5 acres of woodland, and Dahmer had a small hut nearby where he collected insects and the skeletons of small animals such as chipmunks and squirrels. These remains were preserved in jars of formaldehyde and stored in the hut. Dahmer learned techniques to preserve animal bones from his father and began collecting dead animals, including roadkill, which he would dissect and bury. He showed a display of a deceased animal to a friend, claiming he had discovered it by chance. Dahmer was an outcast from the start of his freshman year in Revere High School. He started drinking alcohol at the age of 14, hiding it inside his jacket for school. He told a classmate that the alcohol was his medicine. Despite being uncommunicative, he was perceived as polite, intelligent, and had average grades by the staff. He was also a competitive tennis player and briefly played in the high school band. In 1977, Dahmer's grades were struggling and his parents tried to improve his performance with a tutor, but it was unsuccessful. They also attempted to save their marriage through counseling, but their relationship continued to deteriorate after a discovery of infidelity. The divorce became bitter and Lionel moved out in 1978, living temporarily in a motel. Dahmer graduated from high school in May 1978. A teacher caught him drinking beer near the school before graduation and Dahmer mentioned personal problems at home. After graduation, his mother and younger brother moved to live with relatives in Wisconsin, while Dahmer stayed in the family home. His parents' divorce was finalized on July 24, 1978. Joyce was awarded custody of her younger son. 3 weeks after graduation, Dahmer committed his first murder. Dahmer enlisted in the U.S. Army in January 1979 and underwent basic training and medical specialist training in Alabama and Texas, respectively. While in Texas, He was reprimanded for alcohol-related incidents, including insubordination that resulted in punishment for his entire platoon. On July 13, 1979, he was deployed to West Germany as a combat medic and initially performed average to slightly above average. However, his alcohol abuse caused a decline in performance and he was discharged from the Army in 1981 with an honorable discharge. After his discharge from the Army in 1981, Jeffrey Dahmer was sent to South Carolina for debriefing and received a plane ticket to travel anywhere. He chose to go to Miami Beach, Florida instead of facing his father. He got a job at a delicatessen, rented a room in a motel, but was soon evicted for non-payment due to spending most of his salary on alcohol. He spent his evenings on the beach and worked at the sandwich shop until he eventually called his father and returned to Ohio in September. After his return to Ohio, Dahmer initially lived with his father and stepmother and insisted on being delegated numerous chores to occupy his time while he looked for work. He continued to drink heavily, and 2 weeks after his return, Dahmer was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct. He was fined $60 and given a suspended 10-day jail sentence. Dahmer's father tried unsuccessfully to wean his son off alcohol. In December 1981, he and Dahmer's stepmother sent him to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. Dahmer's grandmother was the only family member to whom Dahmer displayed any affection. They hoped that her influence, plus the change of location, might persuade Dahmer to quit drinking, find a job, and live responsibly. Initially, Dahmer's living arrangements with his grandmother were harmonious. He accompanied her to church, willingly undertook chores, actively sought work, and abided by most of her house rules, although he continued to drink and smoke. In early 1982, Dahmer found employment as a phlebotomist at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. He held this job for a total of 10 months before being laid off. Dahmer remained unemployed for over 2 years, during which he lived upon whatever money his grandmother gave him. In January 1985, Dahmer was hired as a mixer at the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, where he worked from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 6 nights per week, with Saturday evenings off. The Gruesome Murders. In 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer met 25-year-old Stephen Twomey at a bar and convinced him to come back to the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee, where Dahmer had rented a room for the night. Dahmer claimed that he only intended to drug Twomey and explore his body, but the next morning, he woke up to find Twomey dead with extensive bruising and a crushed chest. Dahmer had no memory of killing Twomey and later told investigators that he couldn't believe it had happened. 2 months after killing Stephen Twomey, Jeffrey Dahmer encountered James Dockstader, a 14-year-old Native American. Dahmer lured him to his grandmother's home, where he drugged and strangled him to death, leaving him on the floor of the cellar. March 24, 1988, marked a fateful day for Richard Guerrero, a 22-year-old man who crossed paths with Jeffrey Dahmer outside a bar called the Phoenix. Dahmer offered Guerrero $50 to spend the night with him at his grandmother's residence. However, once they arrived, Dahmer had other plans in mind. He drugged Guerrero with sleeping pills and eventually strangled him with a leather strap. On April 23, Dahmer lured Ronald Flowers Jr. to his house and offered him drugged coffee. However, just as Dahmer and Flowers were about to take things to the next level, Dahmer's grandmother unexpectedly called out for him, causing him to abort his plan. Although Dahmer was able to keep Flowers unconscious until he took him to the hospital, his twisted plan had ultimately failed. In September 1988, Jeffrey Dahmer's drinking and habit of bringing young men to his grandmother's house became too much to handle, and she asked him to move out. Dahmer found a new apartment and moved in on September 25. However, just 2 days later, he was arrested for luring a boy to his home, drugging him, and fondling him. On January 30, 1989, Jeffrey Dahmer pleaded guilty to enticing a child for immoral purposes, and his sentencing was suspended until May. On March 20, Dahmer took a 10-day Easter break from work and moved back into his grandmother's home. Just 2 months before his sentencing for sexual assault, Dahmer met 24-year-old aspiring model Anthony Sears at a bar on March 25, 1989. Dahmer claimed he wasn't looking to commit a crime that night, but Sears started talking to him. What followed was a web of deceit and manipulation as Dahmer lured Sears to his grandmother's house, drugged him, and ultimately strangled him. On May 23, 1989, Dahmer was sentenced to 5 years of probation and 1 year in the House of Correction with work release permitted so that he could keep his job. He was also required to register as a sex offender. However, just 2 months before his scheduled release from the work camp, Dahmer was paroled, and his 5 years of probation began at this point. After his release, Dahmer temporarily moved back to his grandmother's home in West Allis. On May 14, 1990, Dahmer moved into apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street. Despite being in a high-crime area, the apartment was close to his workplace, furnished, and economical at $300 per month. Within a week of moving in, Dahmer killed his 6th victim, Raymond Smith, by giving him a drink laced with sleeping pills and then manually strangling him inside the apartment. About a week after he killed Raymond Smith, Dahmer lured another young man to his apartment. However, he accidentally consumed the drink that was meant for his guest, causing him to pass out. When he woke up the next day, he realized that the intended victim had stolen his clothing, $300, and a watch. Despite this, Dahmer never reported the incident to the police, although he did mention it to his probation officer on May 29. In June of 1990, Dahmer enticed Edward Smith, a 27-year-old acquaintance, to his apartment where he proceeded to drug and strangle him. In less than 3 months after murdering Edward Smith, Dahmer encountered a 22-year-old man named Ernest Miller outside a bookstore on the corner of North 27th Street. Miller agreed to go with Dahmer to his apartment for $50 and allowed him to listen to his heart and stomach. However, Dahmer gave Miller a drink laced with only 2 sleeping pills. Without enough sedatives to kill him, Dahmer resorted to slashing Miller's carotid artery, causing him to bleed to death within minutes. 3 weeks after killing Miller, Dahmer met David Thomas, a 22-year-old father of 2, at the Grand Avenue Mall on September 24. Dahmer invited him back to his apartment for drinks and offered him money to pose for photographs. After giving Thomas a sedative-laced drink, Dahmer didn't feel attracted to him but was too afraid to let him wake up. He eventually strangled him to death. After killing David Thomas, Dahmer did not commit any murders for almost 5 months. However, during that time, he made several unsuccessful attempts to lure men to his apartment. Throughout 1990, he expressed feelings of anxiety and depression to his probation officer, often mentioning his sexuality, financial troubles, and his isolated life. He was also worried about facing his father and younger brother. Dahmer even talked about having suicidal thoughts. After a several-month hiatus, in February 1991, Dahmer spotted 17-year-old Curtis Straughter at a bus stop near Marquette University. He lured Straughter to his apartment, drugged him, and then cuffed his hands behind his back before strangling him with a leather strap. In April 1991, Dahmer lured a 19-year-old man named Errol Lindsay to his apartment under the pretext of offering him money to accompany him, even though Lindsay was heterosexual. Once inside, Dahmer drugged him and attempted to create a permanent, submissive state by injecting hydrochloric acid into Lindsay's brain. Lindsay briefly regained consciousness and complained of a headache before Dahmer drugged him again and strangled him to death. In 1991, the residents of the Oxford Apartments repeatedly complained to the building manager, Sopa Princeville, about foul smells coming from apartment 213, along with strange noises including the sound of falling objects and an occasional chainsaw sound. Princeville contacted Dahmer in response to these complaints, and initially, Dahmer excused the odors as being caused by his broken freezer, which caused the contents to spoil. Later on, he told Princeville that the odor was due to the recent deaths of his tropical fish, and that he would take care of the matter. On May 24, 1991, Dahmer met 31-year-old Tony Hughes, an aspiring model, at a nightclub. Dahmer lured him to his apartment with an offer of money to pose for photos. Hughes was drugged and then injected with hydrochloric acid in an attempt to disable his will and make him submissive. However, the injection proved to be fatal, and Hughes died as a result of the injection. On May 26, 1991, Dahmer encountered a Lao teenager named Cannibal on the street and offered him money to pose for Polaroid pictures. Unknown to Dahmer, Synthasomphone was the younger brother of a boy he had molested in 1988. After initially being reluctant, Synthasomphone changed his mind and went with Dahmer to his apartment, where he was drugged with hydrochloric acid and rendered unconscious. Dahmer then drank beer and fell asleep before leaving to buy more alcohol. In the early morning hours of May 27, Dahmer returned to his apartment and found Cannibal Synthasomphone sitting on the corner of 25th and State, talking in loud, with 3 young women standing near him in distress. Dahmer approached the women and tried to convince them that Synthasomphone was his friend, but the women had already called 911. When police officers arrived, Dahmer claimed that Cannibal Synthasomphone was his 19-year-old boyfriend who had been drinking following a quarrel. However, one of the women present tried to inform the officers that Synthasomphone had struggled against Dahmer's attempts to take him to his apartment before their arrival. The officer dismissed her and told her not to interfere. After the police arrived at the scene, 3 members of the Milwaukee Fire Department also arrived and examined Cannibal Synthasomphone for injuries. They provided a yellow blanket to cover him, but the police officers directed the fire department personnel to leave. Later, Officer Richard Perubkan arrived at the scene and, along with Gabrish and Balcerzik, escorted Dahmer and Synthasomphone to Dahmer's apartment. Throughout the journey, Dahmer commented on the general crime in the neighborhood and expressed his appreciation of the police. Inside his apartment, Dahmer showed the police officers 2 Polaroid pictures he had taken of Synthasomphone, in an attempt to prove they were lovers. Despite a strange smell emanating from the decomposing body of Hughes, one of the officers only peeked his head around the bedroom and did not take a proper look. The officers left, advising Dahmer to take good care of Synthasomphone. This incident was recorded as a domestic dispute in the police report. After the officers left his apartment, Dahmer injected Cannibal Synthasomphone with hydrochloric acid a second time, which ultimately proved to be fatal. On June 30, Dahmer met 20-year-old Matt Turner at a bus station in Chicago and convinced him to travel to Milwaukee for a professional photo shoot. But once inside Dahmer's apartment, Turner was drugged, strangled, and killed. Despite his disappearance, Turner was not reported missing. 5 days later, on July 5, Dahmer brought 23-year-old Jeremiah Weinberger from a Chicago bar to his apartment under the pretense of spending the weekend together. He gave Weinberger drugs and then injected boiling water into his body not once, but twice, which put him in a coma. Weinberger died 2 days later. On July 15, Dahmer encountered 24-year-old Oliver Lacey at the corner of 27th and Kilbourne. Dahmer convinced Lacey to come to his apartment to pose for photographs but then drugged him. Unlike his previous victims, Dahmer intended to keep Lacey alive for a longer period. However, he was unsuccessful in rendering Lacey unconscious with chloroform. On July 19, 4 days after the encounter with Oliver Lacey, Jeffrey Dahmer received news that he was fired from his job. Upon receipt of this news, he lured 25-year-old Joseph Bradahoff to his apartment. Dahmer strangled Bradahoff and left his body lying on his bed, covered with a sheet, for 2 days. That concludes part 1 of our video series on Jeffrey Dahmer. We hope that this installment has provided you with a comprehensive understanding of Dahmer's early life and the events that led to his descent into darkness. In part 2, we will take a closer look at the investigation and capture of Jeffrey Dahmer. From the discovery of his crimes to the trial and ultimate conviction, we will delve into the process that brought this notorious serial killer to justice. Join us in our next video as we explore the dramatic conclusion to the chilling tale of Jeffrey Dahmer.